So this is the second part of diagnosing Fleet Street today, Monday, the 21st of September 2020. This is the day when the so-called ban on eviction proceedings in county courts across England is being lifted, thus exposing millions of people to all kinds of attacks on their rights, most significantly focusing, of course, on the right to housing. And the seriously disturbing aspect of this is that conservatives are now trying to increase the lockdowns, and they're doing so in the middle of severe kind of criticisms coming from their own ranks, simply motivated by their own individual careers and opportunities in the electoral kind of game. So it is factually, evidentially contradictory and totally irresponsible, and shows the brazenness of the lack of care that Boris Johnson fronts and represents and typifies. I mean, even the Financial Times is saying that Sunak is retreating on the support schemes because he was going to stop the support schemes. Although essentially the support schemes were supporting the rich and the business owners, big business owners, still it had a residual kind of impact, positive impact in providing some help to the poorer and the low income sections. So when the surge is that clear that they are going back on their other plans, how is it that they are in total denial of the effect the surge is going to have when more people are going to be thrown out of their homes as a result of the eviction proceedings being revived today? And there is no sign in anything that Keir Starmer has said yesterday during the kind of photo calls and during the contacts with the media yesterday about the 80th anniversary of the Second World War Spitfire kind of achievements and heroism, which is what was the trigger for his retort to the assumed critics of the Labour Party that the Labour Party was not patriotic enough. Now, how is Keir Starmer's silence going to help the patriotic people? Most of the people, hundreds of thousands of people in the kind of firing line of the evictions process are patriotic people. Where is the delivery of patriotic support by the Labour Party, holding the government to account and making the government stop this ban being lifted? And in fact, stop and go forward and stop the whole idea of evictions from being pursued and allowed. So there is nothing there in Starmer's kind of patriotic spiel. Now, the school funding unfair to poor white people in the Times is actually based on something that is taken from the Mail on Sunday, and also the source is the two persons that have apparently done the research at the University of Plymouth, and their paper submitted to the House of Commons Education Select Committee, which is conducting an inquiry on left behind white peoples from disadvantaged backgrounds. Now, these are two academics. One is Alex Gibson, a senior research fellow in the university's School of Medicine, and Sheena Astana, director of its Institute of Health and Care Research. Now, these two are quoted as saying, as a result, it is difficult to, as a result of the behavior, the obstruction by the Department for Education to access the data that it has on the various discrimination policies and practices. And Astana and Gibson are quoted as saying, these data are always aggregated in ways that reflect the particular interests or perceptions of the DFE. As a result, it's difficult to explore aspects of performance and progress which do not align with the DFE's focus, including with respect to the underachievement of white pupils. This undermines external scrutiny. Now, the concept of scrutiny is being misused there. It should not be a one off thing about white pupils only. It should be always a recurring, ongoing, continuous kind of scrutiny, objectively defined, of the whole behavior, the whole policy, the whole consideration, and the perceptions and the realities about the perceived kind of behavior and the status of the children and their families and their backgrounds. So, what the Times is doing there is artificial to the kind of on a number of levels. First of all, it is not reporting based on the evidence that the Times has access to. The Times is sent every week, literally hundreds of communications, if not more, that affect the level of income of people in society, regardless of background, ethnicity, gender, whatever. And the Times suppresses those. The Times, in common with the rest of Fleet Street, suppresses all of those and all the evidence. And the point is that if they suppress all the evidence all the time, then this kind of report cannot be doing the correction that is needed to the wrong that is obviously being inflicted on the quote one part of the population, which is the poor white children. And the poor white children are not being cheated just in terms of education funding, but in terms of everything else, because most of the poor white children are assumed not to exist, to have no kind of voices to speak for them in terms of income, in terms of their social relegation. So there is no known campaigning group that is actually active speaking for poor white people, not just children, their parents as well as families, and they're similarly kind of socially disadvantaged and economically disadvantaged relations and relatives. And it is true of London, it's true of inner London, as it is true of the outer London and other parts of England. So where is Keir Starmer delivering a reversal of that kind of situation with his patriotism? What is patriotism? Patriotism is Donald Trump lying to the people about perceived enemies of, quote, America. There is no America without the people that he has kind of consigned to various categories of being bad. America, as it is now, is based on the massacre and genocide of the original people whom Trump would ban from America. So, when patriotism is identified with somebody like Trump, Keir Starmer has to be extremely careful and he has to check his facts before he uses that kind of phrase saying that patriotism has been the core of the Labour values or Labour Party all the time. It hasn't been. The Labour Party would not exist if it were a patriotic party in the sense that Trump defines it, in the sense that the Tories define it, in the sense that the racists define it. Because if it were, it would not have existed, because there would be no reason to claim to be different from the status quo parties and arrangements which were already overly patriotic. That is to say, overly corrupt and lying and in denial, and were failing most of the white people at the time, as the case of the Poplar Borough councillors highlighted and focused on, because the Tories were attacking the poor people of Poplar, which is what the Poplar councillors were opposing. They were standing up for the poor people of Poplar. So that is what the Labour Party needs to do for the poor people and poor pupils, poor men, poor women, and people in poverty generally. And there should be no need to distinguish between patriots and perceived non-patriots. I mean, what is he saying by patriots? Who are the people he is not including in his patriotism thing? That is something that Keir Starmer is in danger of abusing and misusing and inflaming racism, because the reason why the Labour Party lost the North is not because Labour Party was not patriotic, because that is stupid. That shows that Brexit is patriotic. So that shows reverses the actual evidence. So patriotism was not what drove Brexit. It was the opposite. It was the lack of understanding of the society and the community and the country and the people's kind of rights and needs and the absence of justice. All of these were conflated and kind of put in a packet, which was used, labeled the EU, and all the wrong things, all the failures, all the corruption, criminality, lack of legality, and lack of equality, all of them were put in one bag and basket, and that basket was called the EU. Keir Starmer has to understand the evidence and the fact and go back to that evidence. Now, going to the question of Keir Starmer being silent about the poverty and the eviction proceedings being started, let's give some case examples of eviction, how evictions take place, and how and what role the county courts, which is where the most of the applications will be rubber stamped, starting from the removal of the restrictions with effect from today, Monday, the 21st of September 2020. The county courts, the evidence is, and I'm just going by evidence, is populated, the judicial kind of members of the judiciary in the county courts, the judges, deputy judges or district judges or deputy district judges, are first of all prejudiced against the people, the victims of evictions and victims of other litigation attacks. So the county courts are geared to serving the rich and the landlords and others, and to obstructing and denying the poor and the victims. So the difference between going to court and not going to court is this. Once you go to court, or once the matter is kind of processed through the court, county court, it has become rubber stamped and it has become kind of part of the record and part of the authoritative official kind of action. That's it. There is nothing that happens to enhance the right to say, the right to housing, the right to justice. Nothing like that happens in the county courts. I've been saying this for as long as I've been talking about it, because that is the evidence, that is the reality of county courts and their roles. So, for example, here is a kind of reference to county courts, and I shall be doing this in a minute. This is a summary of the role of a licensed law trader who actually lied against the client who was being evicted completely unfairly and without any reason. And the evictor was the Tower Hamlets Community Housing. And this is the kind of summary. This is the summary about the behavior of one of the judges. Well, the summary reference, and it is based on the proceedings before Deputy District Judge Judith Goodman. The Goodman sat on that day, 10th of November, 10th of December, 10th of November 2011. 10th of November 2011, no December, 10th of November 2011. Now that was the anniversary of 10th of November 1993, when Hattie Manners, that's Henrietta Manners, had actually racistly obstructed a victim of eviction and colluded with the eviction process and denied the victim any say. And the victim was evicted on that date, Henrietta Manners. Now, Henrietta Manners did that in 1993. So 7 plus 11. So that is 18 years later. 18 years later, Judith Goodman conspired against the same person in the same court, let's say, because it was a merged court. The first one in 93 was Shoreditch County Court, but the one in that form in July, in August, in September, in 2011 was Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court. So Manners repeated her racist, criminal attack on the target of the eviction process, which was wrong on both occasions. And she and Goodman conspired to attack the appeal application by the same person in the Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court that was listed on the 10th of November 2011. And the listing was done with the collusion and collaboration of a barrister, licensed law trader from Garden Chambers in the Lincoln's Inn, Garden House Chambers in the Lincoln's Inn, called Edward Fitzpatrick, who is a criminal and a liar and a racist, as is Judith Goodman, criminal, a liar and a racist, as is Henrietta Manners, a criminal and a liar and a racist, and as is the little solicitor who was only 2 years kind of past her admission. That was Lucie, Lucie Green, Greene. Lucie Green, who allegedly instructed Edward, the racist liar, allegedly on behalf of the client. And the client was appealing. And it should have been a straightforward appeal, because the original application for the appeal hearing was accepted by the then deputy judge, who suddenly became unavailable for the actual hearing. And she had correctly stopped the eviction process by the Tower Hamlets Community Housing, pending the appeal. It was the appeal that was sabotaged and subverted by the collusion of racists, including Judith Goodman, Henrietta Manners, the particular admin staff in place at the time in allocating and scheduling the hearing of the appeal at the Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court, and Edward Fitzpatrick, Lucie Green, and others, others including a barrister for the Tower Hamlets Community Housing called a man called Lane, another racist, another liar, another criminal. So all of them behaved contrary to the rule of law, contrary to due process, and solely in order to deprive the particular applicant of all the rights to having a fair hearing. That is what they were engaged in doing, and they performed that without any problem because there was no opposition from the so-called instructed barrister, and there was no application against that behavior which Judith Goodman kind of spewed a pack of lies against the appellant. Nothing to do with the application, nothing to do with the actual evidence whatsoever. So I said in previous kind of pieces, editions, that we shall be going into the necessary detail about the behavior of Judith Goodman, Edward Fitzpatrick, Lucy Green, Henrietta Manners, and Alan, or whatever the first name is of this barrister who appeared at that charade for the Tower Hamlets community housing. This is the next part of the detail. And this part is focusing on the transcript of a phone call. The transcript of a phone call dated in the week before the actual hearing, before Manners, Henrietta Manners, in July, probably 27th of July 2011, in the Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court. And the conspiracy later between Henrietta Manners and Judith Goodman was based on the agenda to prevent the overturning of Henrietta Manners' racist, illegal, and prejudiced decision against the particular appellant. So that was July 2011, and the hearing of the appeal was staged on the 10th of November 2011. So July, August, September, October, November. So that's just 4 months, less than 4 months. And the contents of the phone call on the Friday before the 27th of July between the appellant, who was then the kind of defendant in the possession action, and the Tower Hamlets community housing employee concerned, ended with the appellant, but that time not yet appellant because the formal rubber stamping had not taken place, said to the Tower Hamlets community housing person that they would send updated versions and the details of the rejection of the application to the court. And in the morning of the hearing, the 27th of July 2011, all the emails were sent. All the emails were sent rebutting everything in the application by the Tower Hamlets community housing. So the court person looking at it, Henrietta Manners, should have read the contents and should have postponed the hearing and should have asked or ordered the defendant who was not present there to appear and give their reasons in person if necessary. But she didn't do that. She completely ignored the evidence in writing or before her in writing, and she gave the straightforward eviction order in favor of the Tower Hamlets community housing. Now, anyone who is not familiar with the kind of legal corruption and code corruption system in this country needs this information I'm about to give in the next sentence. The application for possession was based on a false ground that there was rent arrears. There was no rent arrears at all. It was a contrived excuse created by the collaboration and collusion between the Tower Hamlets Council Housing Benefit Manager, Steve Hill, and the DWP racist liars and the racists at the Tower Hamlets Community Housing, led by the racist criminal Michael Tyrrell. That is the basis of the rejection of the ground, and the ground was rejected on those grounds, on those factual basis. And the role played by the DWP, Steve Hill and Mike Tyrrell, are all contained in detailed documentary representations made by the tenant. So it wasn't like hypothesis or guesswork or kind of assumptions and suppositions, whatever. It was actually date, chapter, and verse, everything was detailed, and every incident was recorded in writing, and everything was explained and stated and asserted. Now, at the time, in Tower Hamlets Council, there was a person working in the chief executive's office. And that person was told about what was going on. And the monitoring officer, or the so-called head of the legal section in Tower Hamlets Council, the local council, at that time was Isabella Freeman. Isabella Freeman was sent all the information, as was the then chief executive. And the chief executive office was kind of led by a woman called Carol Marchant. Now, Carol Marchant acknowledged all the communications, and Carol Marchant did her best to convey the various evidence that was being conveyed to the chief executive, and she was the one who accessed the chief executive's emails and kind of spoke or communicated on behalf of the chief executive in post at the time, whoever the chief executive was. And Carol Marchant had a previous series of communications with the particular tenant. Based on that, Carol Marchant knew the antecedents and all the backgrounds. So Carol Marchant, this is very important. Carol Marchant was in place. This was the year 2011, the year after Lutfur Rahman became the executive mayor of Tower Hamlets. So he was the executive head of the entire council. He could do anything, including, as has been detailed by Richard Morey, the election commissioner, who called Lutfur Rahman as having been elected by corrupt and fraudulent means in his ruling on the published on the 23rd of April 2015. Lutfur Rahman was awarding not 100 pounds, 200 pounds, actually hundreds of thousands of pounds of public money to any number of people that Lutfur Rahman considered would be useful to Lutfur Rahman's tenure in place or his election. That's the finding of the election commissioner, who banned Lutfur Rahman for 5 years from public office. Now, this was happening, this county court proceedings and the criminal collusion among Mike Tyrrell, Steve Hill, the DWP, this was happening in the year after Lutfur Rahman became elected. So it was very much at the beginning of Lutfur Rahman's years in office as the executive mayor. And all of this was brought to Lutfur Rahman's attention, what was going on. Not every single item, but the essential evidence was being put to him. And Lutfur Rahman made dozens of promises to look into it and to stop the wrongdoing. That is the description the tenant gave him based on the evidence, and Lutfur Rahman promised. Lutfur Rahman never said that he would not look into it. Lutfur Rahman kept saying that he would look into it and he would stop it. He did not look into it and he did not stop it because Carol Marchant suddenly disappeared in September. This is the anniversary. Carol Marchant disappeared from the employment of Tower Hamlets Council very soon after this got heated up, this whole communication and the demands for action by Tower Hamlets Council to stop Mike Tyrrell and Tower Hamlets Community Housing from doing the latest corrupt, criminal, racistly motivated attack on the rights of the particular tenant. Carol Marchant suddenly disappeared. Now, the reason was never explained. Carol Marchant had regular conversations with the particular tenant, because the particular tenant rang to discuss and update the council's chief executive on all the relevant issues. And Carol Marchant, therefore, had regular conversations with the particular tenant. But she never, ever even hinted at being about to leave the council. Because Carol Marchant had been speaking with the particular tenant for a long number of years, going back to the 1990s when Sylvie Pierce, the first so-called female chief executive of Tower Hamlet Council, was in place. And it was Sylvie Pierce who was the first chief executive that Carol Marchant served as in her position as an employee in the council. So 1996 was 3 years after Henrietta Manners attacked the rights of the particular tenant at the Shoreditch County Court, as Henrietta Manners gave the eviction kind of orders in favor of Paul Verma. Paul Verma is a crook, and the corruption of Paul Verma, we have hinted at before that, for example, in his original application for the eviction, he said that the tenant had been on television attacking Salman Rushdie. That didn't happen. But it influenced the racist and anti-Muslim Henrietta Manners in the way that must have been intended by whoever wrote that script for Paul the lying Verma. And so therefore this must have been used as evidence of the tenant not having any rights. Even if the tenant had criticized Salman Rushdie, which didn't happen on this occasion, that would not have any legal bearing or evidential bearing, let alone any moral bearing about this on a matter to do with the housing. Now, this is coming to you as the world exclusive diagnosis of the media on Monday, the 21st of September 2020. And it is called world exclusive because it is all these revelations and all these contents are world exclusive. You would not know that unless you somehow coincidentally happen to have hacked all the right kind of emails, accounts, and whatever. You couldn't have done that because if you had hacked, you would have not actually found all the information anyway, because the information is coming from additional research and empirical evidence and sources. So therefore, what has happened is that Henrietta Manners was involved at the beginning. And for decades, she was involved in attacking one particular tenant for absolutely unlawful, illegal reasons, and the reasons only racist and anti-Muslim in the context. So on the 10th of November 2011, the appeal was being staged. It was not a real appeal representing the real grounds and real kind of evidence. It was an appeal being staged by this criminal, racist, liar, Edward Fitzpatrick. The criminal, racist, liar, Edward Fitzpatrick did not do justice to the evidence. And we shall be covering his later behavior and the behavior of the Garden Court or Garden House chambers in the Lincoln's Inn. His so-called colleagues that were supposedly in place to look into the misconduct and the complaints against Edward Fitzpatrick failed to do that. And that shows the latent, built-in criminality, illegality, and corruption in the license law trade. Remember that this is still the diagnosis of the media, because the media is not talking about, which it should be talking about, the resumption of eviction proceedings through the court. So we are talking today about what happens in courts where evictions are rubber stamped or contrived and created and imposed by the licensed law trade and the courts. It's not just the landlord. So, everything I have said here about the 3 licensed law traders or 4 licensed law traders during the staged stunt of the appeal hearing on the 10th of November 2011. I have not mentioned the so-called landlord who had been involved in the original eviction application of the same person in the early 1990s. The reason is that the eviction process is often connected with in the media, in the public kind of references to the applicant, the landlord. And it is never even suggested that the courts and the councils and the lawyers or the law traders are the ones who create the official evictions. Think about that. So here, the eviction was contrived by the racists in the council. Remember, the council being the source of the arrears allegation. That's why the contracts had to be made with Tower Hamlets Council and Carol Marchant and the chief executive. Anyone who may have lost the thread, that is the reminder. So the council-based or council-employed criminal, an illegal evictor, crook, is Steve Hill. Steve Hill is too long in post as the benefits manager in the council. Benefits meaning the administration and the allocation of the housing benefit, the rent kind of rebate that is allowed to people in low income or no income at the time, based on the what is called means, whether they have got enough income to pay the rent or not. So if they haven't got the necessary threshold of the kind of income, then they are entitled to rent rebate, and that is called housing benefit. That is about properties that belong to the council, so council properties. If the person, the tenant, is in a property belonging to private kind of freeholder or what is wrongly called landlord, then the amount of support that is given to them because of the same ground, low income or no income, is called local housing allowance. Now remember, local housing allowance will be the one that we shall be elaborating on in very extensive detail when we get to diagnosing the role of Rukhsana Fiaz and Newham Council. But not in this edition, not this minute. This minute we are still talking about Tower Hamlets Council's housing benefits and Steve Hill, the liar, and the racist who conspired with the DWP and conspired with the Tower Hamlets community housing, which was the second biggest recipient of the largest number of council housing stock being transferred to it in 2006 under the kind of use of power of Tony Blair, and as he was proxied, represented as a proxy by this overstated working class background person, John the Crook Prescott. And the Prescott forced Tower Hamlets Council to transfer most of the stock to the gang of criminals called Popla Harka. And the second criminal, because it wasn't a gang as much as an individual criminal, was Mike Tyrrell, who conspired to form the Tower Hamlets community housing in order to get hold of the thousands of properties belonging to the council, where he had worked before in the 90s as a housing manager in Bethnal Green or Bethnal Green South, whatever the actual area he was covering. And that is where Mike Tyrrell decided to attack the tenant because the tenant was conducting a correct and legal and lawful campaign in defense of a family of victims of racist attacks. And the racist Tyrrell wrongly decided that the campaign was against him personally. It wasn't. So from 1996 July, we move on again to November, 10th of November 2011, when the hearing of the appeal was sabotaged and messed up by Edward Fitzpatrick from Garden Court Chambers in the Lincoln's Inn, and ill-briefed by the ignorant Lucy Green, the very recently admitted solicitor, and aided and abetted by the Tower Hamlets Community Housing's lawyer, somebody called Lane, a racist moron, and a liar called Lane. All of them are in the frame, and they will be diagnosed extensively outside of this particular broadcast because the extensive details are far wider than can be accommodated in a 1 hour or 1.5 hour kind of broadcast. But the fact is that they were aided and abetted in turn by the conspiring pair, Judith Goodman and her hidden partner and mentor, Henrietta Manners. Henrietta Manners and Judith Goodman conspired in the Shoreditch and Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court. And what Judith Goodman said was not in the actual transcript, because the transcript was done by somebody without the permission or the consent or the agreement of the tenant. And the transcript was wrong. And on basing her prejudice aggravated by her misuse of the transcript, Judith Goodman spewed a lot of lies and racist hatred and stupidity against the tenant, and the barrister, so-called Edward Fitzpatrick, stayed silent. He didn't object, nor did the lawyer, the solicitor, Lucy Green. So what happened in that charade is what happens in kind of different kind of detail, but essentially what happens against the tenant being subjected to an eviction application is that they are assumed to have done wrong. Being innocent is interpreted by the courts as being the wrong person or wrong party in the eviction proceedings. And what happened on the 10th of November 2011 in the Clerkenwell and Shoreditch County Court is going to be repeated 1,000 times starting from today. And we shall be continuing this because it is this important. It affects millions of people in the end, and it is going to affect hundreds of thousands of people starting today, Monday, the 21st of September 2020.